What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of the Dolphins In Depth podcast. I'm Daniel Oyefusi. Thanks so much for tuning in. And your Miami Dolphins are continuing to progress in their offseason workout programs. They started organized team activities a couple weeks ago, and Wednesday marks the first of 2 days of their mandatory minicamp. So up to this point, the offseason workout programs have been voluntary. Players do not have to show up, but they're obviously strongly encouraged to, as it's the kind of precursor to training camp late in July. So again, as the Dolphins come together for the first 2 days of mandatory minicamp, we should expect to see a more representative look of this 90-man roster that the Dolphins have put together. We're definitely expecting to see some veterans that haven't been in attendance in the previous days and weeks. So it should be good to see how the team is progressing with a more representative look at that roster. But again, we're starting to kind of transition and lead really into the dog days of the offseason, really of the calendar year when it comes to football. You have the Super Bowl that ends in February, but March, April, May, we have combine and draft and free agency and obviously the offseason workout program. But after next week, the players are going to be away from the facility for a month. There's not going to be a lot going on. People are just going to be chomping at the bit for some football, especially in South Florida with the Miami Heat unfortunately getting knocked out of the Eastern Conference Finals, not making it to the NBA Finals. So again, we're kind of starving for content here, and I wanted to kind of switch things up and do something really fun and cool. So I did a call out earlier in the week to all my followers on Twitter at Daniel Oyefusi, and I said, hey, what do you guys want to know? What do you want to talk about? What questions do you have about the team, about how offseason workouts have been going on, and how maybe how the team is stacking up as we kind of get into training camp and really wait for the start of the 2022 season. So I'm going to devote this episode to answering some really, really good questions that was posed to me, and as well as kind of preview mandatory minicamp toward the end of this pod. But we're going to get right into it, and we're going to get into it with everyone's favorite topic, which is Tua Tagovailoa. And this question actually comes from a friend of the podcast, somebody who has actually come on as a guest. That's DJ BNMA, who is the Jets writer for the New York Daily News. So shout out to DJ for this question. I know he wanted to ruffle some feathers and rile stuff up. So we're going to get right into it with this question. And he asked a great question. He asked how much of the concerns regarding Tua's deep ball is just overblown. First, DJ is a really close friend of mine, a really good friend of mine. And this is something that we've talked about a lot when we've discussed quarterback and quarterback play and what you need to be an elite quarterback. So I think this is a great question because as I've said multiple times, Tua is one of, if not the most polarizing quarterback in the NFL right now. And obviously with the big additions that the Dolphins have made this offseason, getting Tyreek Hill, getting Teron Armstead, hiring Mike McDaniel as head coach, there are a lot of eyes on Tua for the 2022 season. And there's been a lot of discourse surrounding Tua already, even during the offseason workout programs. And a lot of that obviously is around the arm strength. Does Tua have the arm and the arm talent to hit his receivers and hit all these receivers, these new receivers and these new talented players that the Dolphins have surrounded him by? We've heard Tyreek Hill and others come to Tua's defense, praise Tua and the work that he's put in this offseason workout program. But again, this doesn't really mean anything until we see it on the field. But I did want to address, the narrative about Tua's arm strength, because I think it's a really interesting one. Because as Tua, as a young quarterback, as somebody specifically in the class of 2020, in that draft class, he's naturally going to be compared to the Joe Burrows of the world, the Justin Herberts of the world, even the Josh Allens of the world, in terms of, their arm talent and their ability. And I think that most people, the overwhelming majority of people would argue, or they wouldn't argue where Tua ranks in terms of the arm strength. They wouldn't, he doesn't have a Josh Allen, a Matt Stafford, a Justin Herbert type arm. But in terms of arm strength, arm accuracy, really the ability to place the ball downfield where it needs to be, I think, and as Tyreek Hill said, I think Tua is actually a lot better than people like to give him credit for. And this is speaking as somebody that watched him for the 12 or 13 games that he appeared in last season and has seen him. Does Tua throw the ball downfield a lot? No, but I think that when he does, he's actually very accurate, and he's shown that he has the ability to get the ball downfield. But if you don't believe me, I gathered some numbers just to kind of, I guess, maybe prove my point or to support my point. So again, Tua maybe doesn't have the strongest arm in the NFL, but I think it is more than capable. And just looking at some numbers that I dug up prior to this recording, so of 33 qualified quarterbacks, Tua ranked 30th in intended air yards per pass attempt, and that's according to Pro Football Reference. We know it was very much a dink and dunk offense last year, very RPO based, short pass based. We all know that, and the numbers show that he didn't really throw the ball downfield. But again, we know that was mainly because of the scheme and really the structure of this offense. The fact that they kind of had to because of the struggles with the offensive line. It was arguably the worst. You can say it was the worst statistically. They gave up the most pressures in the NFL according to Pro Football Focus. So that kind of accentuated the fact that, Tua had to get the ball out of his hands quickly. And the numbers show that again. The average time to throw before a pass attempt or a pressure for Tua was 2.1 seconds. And that was tied 33 out of 33 qualified quarterbacks, again, according to Pro Football Reference. So whether it was by design or by the fact that the offensive line wasn't holding up, Tua had to get the ball out of his hands quickly, and he did. Now, when we start to kind of transition into the deep attempts and, getting the ball downfield, out of all 33 quarterbacks that threw at least 200 passes last season, Tua attempted 25 deep attempts according to Sports Info Solutions, and deep attempts are defined as passes that travel at least 20 yards in the air. So Tua threw 25, which was through 25, he attempted 25 deep passes, which was amongst the lowest for qualified passes that are quarterbacks that attempted at least 200 passes. However, on those 25 pass attempts, Tua completed 12 of those. So 12 for 25, a 48% completion percentage. My math is not that great, but I know it's that good. It's good enough to do that, 48%. And that completion percentage on quote unquote deep attempts only trailed Kyler Murray out of all 33 quarterbacks. So again, just one database that I used on deep attempts. Tua didn't attempt a lot of deep passes, but when he did, it got there. I mean, whatever you want to say about the mechanics of it, I mean, obviously you want to make sure the mechanics are good, but when he attempted those deep passes, it got there. I think that for the one thing for me, I'm not necessarily looking at how much the deep ball improves, because I mean, truth be told, in the couple practices that we've been able to see, I think Tua has thrown the best deep ball out of all the quarterbacks from the Miami Dolphins roster. So again, I don't think that throwing the ball deep is going to be an issue, but I'm looking for more improvement on the intermediate range. I mean, we know Tua is great in the short range. The numbers show that he is really solid on a short volume, on a small volume of deep passes, but I'm looking at that intermediate range, that 8 to 15 range, 8 to 18 yard range, that intermediate part of the field. I'm looking for improvement there because Tua on those intermediate attempts was 40 for 89, just under 45%. Some of the better quarterbacks in the league are in the 50s, the mid 50s range. So again, we know Tua can get the ball out accurately in short passes. We know that the stats show that he can get the ball to his receivers downfield, even in a small volume. But I'm looking for more improvement in that intermediate range, which is where I think the game of football is won. I mean, you don't see too many quarterbacks throwing the ball 45 yards down the field every other pass. I mean, a lot of times NFL games are won on 3rd and 7, 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9. Can you make those accurate passes in the intermediate range when the defense knows where the sticks are? I mean, that's what I'm looking for from Tua. And I think that, and I've said it multiple times, with these additions on this roster, with this scheme, with the upgrade offensive line, I think we're going to see a vastly improved Tua Tagovailoa. And whether that is enough to lead the Dolphins to the playoffs, I mean, hey, it's a team effort. As much as the quarterback plays a role in the results of the game, it's a team effort. But I think Tua is going to be a lot more improved, and we're going to see it in all facets of this game. So shout out to DJ for that opening question, because I know Tua is always a hotbed topic. The next question I'm going to get into is from, let's see. So we're going to go to Wade Trip 1. who asks, I know it's early, but how are the scheme changes affecting the line and players? So shout out to Trip1 for that question. And I think that's a really interesting question as well, because there's been a lot of fascination and, just intrigue in this West Coast offense, in this zone running scheme offense that Mike McDaniel is building. And again, we're starting to see a little bit of it in these practices that are open to the media once a week. Unfortunately, we're not allowed to, exactly report, specifics of plays and, offensive line combinations and where guys are lined up in certain spots. So I won't do that, but I will say that in talking to the players, they really like this offense, especially on the offensive line. I mean, they like the fact that, most offensive linemen said you're firing off the ball. You get to be the aggressor. You get to initiate everything that's going on the offense. So I think that, again, this offensive line is really, really going to benefit from the creativity of this offense. They're going to really be able to benefit from using their athleticism, because you look at guys like Robert Hunt and Austin Jackson. I mean, Austin Jackson, the guy that has struggled, but he has all the physical traits in the world. So I think that it's definitely going to be a scheme that plays to the strength of this offensive line. Outside of that, it's interesting to also talk to players who say, at the end of the day, football is football. The scheme might be a little bit different, but everyone more or less runs the same thing in terms of maybe like the pass concepts and the route combinations and stuff like that. It's just a matter for them of getting, the playbook down, getting the language down, because maybe McDaniel teaches things, or we know that he teaches things in a different way. So it's really a matter of getting that language down and getting the playbook down and making sure that all 11 players are on page. And really the big thing for Tua, because we know that this is his third new offense in as many years in the NFL. So he has played in a West Coast based scheme, in his time in Alabama. But for him, and as he said, it's just a matter of getting that language down. But obviously, and I think that the offensive line is going to benefit the most from this scheme change. The last question I'm going to take before we take a short break comes from, let's see, Finn Fabulous 13, who asked a similar question kind of regarding the scheme and whatnot. And he says, who is your money on for right tackle, Jackson, Eichenberg, or other? The position still makes me queasy. So thank you to Finn Fabulous 13 for that question. And yeah, I think that the Dolphins have done a lot to address all the deficiencies in this roster, particularly on the offensive line and at the skill position. So you add Tyreek Hill, you add Cedric Wilson, you add Mostert, Sony Michel, Chase Edmonds at running back, and even Connor Williams at center. But yeah, I think that there are still some legitimate questions at offensive line, particularly at right tackle, like you mentioned, and at center, because we still don't know who that starting center is going to be. Again, we're not allowed to report exactly who has been practicing where up until training camp, and when those are open to fans, then the fans will get to see and we'll get to report exactly who's starting where. But yeah, I mean that's a very valid concern, because I think that while Teron Armstead will definitely lock down the left side, and if healthy, he should be a very, very good to Pro Bowl level left tackle. At the end of the day, right tackle still Tua's blind side. That's where he's not necessarily able to see when he's dropping back. So our reporting at the Miami Herald has been that Liam Eichenberg and Austin Jackson are going to get every opportunity to start at right tackle, or to start on this offensive line. Again, the question is, if I had to kind of put my money on it, who would I put my money on? And I would say Austin Jackson, just because this is a guy who, growing up was a tackle. I mean, he played left tackle at USC. He told us that he split time at right tackle and in different phases of his, pre-NFL career. And when you look at just the measurables and the athleticism and all the physical traits, I mean, it does look like a player who might be able to kind of, I don't want to say salvage his career, maybe get on the right side or kind of turn things around from the move to left side to the right side, where maybe there's not as much pressure on him. I think that coming out of college, the knock on Liam Eichenberg was maybe he doesn't have the athleticism. He has the technique, maybe not the athleticism, maybe not the physical traits to line up consistently at left tackle. Maybe he needs to go to right tackle or guard. But again, we're definitely several months away from deciding what happens there. And I think that potentially what happens at center could really have an impact, maybe have like a domino effect on the rest of the offensive line. We know Michael Dieter was the incumbent. He is the incumbent. He started several games at center in 2021, but we know that Connor Williams has some experience, at least in the preseason and in training camp, snapping at center. Mike McDaniel did more or less confirm that they've moved him around on the offensive line because he has flexibility on the interior offensive line. So if, Connor Williams doesn't end up starting at left guard and he starts at center, I mean, again, that could be a domino effect. And they could move guys around and try to get the best 5 guys on the offensive line. But again, right now, if you had to kind of put my feet to the fire and ask me who I think is going to be the day one starter at right tackle, I would say Austin Jackson. I mean, I think that there is a slight possibility that they could bring in a veteran between now and training camp or now in week 1. But I think they're definitely giving these young guys every opportunity to grasp this offense and to show what they can do. At the end of the day, I have a good feeling that it's going to be Austin Jackson that's starting at right tackle. So thank you to everyone for the first half of those questions. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back on the other side of things, we're going to keep on taking more fan questions, talk rookies, talk some personnel, talk potential roster cuts down the line. Training camp is coming in a month, and then we'll start to see the dwindling of this roster from 90 to 53. So stay locked with us. What's going on, everybody? Still here on the Dolphins In Depth podcast, taking fan questions ahead of the start of mandatory minicamp for the Dolphins. That first day starts June 1st. Then they'll wrap up the second day on June 2nd. Then they have one more practice, OTA practice, open to the media before they send players away for a month, give them a little break from the off-season workout program, and then they come back and kick things back up for training camp in late July. So I answered a couple questions on Tua, on the offensive line, on the scheme. In the second half, I want to get into some other really, really good questions that some people asked me on Twitter. So this next question I'm going to answer is from @EliJTS. He says, what would be the most headline grabbing roster cut that should not be a surprise? And when do you expect it to happen? I think this is a really, really interesting question because we saw a situation last year and last summer where 2 veterans who were billed as potential starters and potential major contributors in 2021, we saw them cut before the start of the regular season. And that was obviously linebacker Bernard McKinney, who the Dolphins got in a trade, and center Matt Skura, who they signed as a free agent. Both of those guys were actually cut in the first round of the cuts. I mean, they didn't even make it to the final, roster cuts. Those were very, very early cuts in training camp. And again, I mean, that was kind of a shocking move for the Dolphins. And I bring that up because I think we find ourselves in a situation this year when you look at the roster. This is a very young roster, but it's a very, very talented roster. And I think that for the most part, a lot of the positions are really solidified, not only in terms of starters, but in terms of depth. I mean, we're over a month or about a month away from the start of training camp. And I think it's pretty clear which veterans are kind of on the quote unquote hot seat or on the bubble. I look at guys like wide receiver Preston Williams, Myles Gaskin. Those are players who have had significant roles in previous years, but the Dolphins added a lot of talent at their respective position groups. And it's clear right now that if they want to be on this roster week 1 of the 2022 season, I mean, they're going to have to go out there and earn it. I mean, their spots are by no means solidified. So those are 2 vets who I think are already on the bubble right now. And both of those guys have been frequent attendees at some of these voluntary sessions so far. One name that I think was brought up earlier in free agency, who was thought of as a potential cap casualty, was safety Eric Rowe. The Dolphins could have saved $2.5 million by cutting him, but they didn't. He's still on the roster. He kind of slots as the team's backup safety. And I get the sense that I think that he'll stick around and he'll make this roster just because of his versatility and just because of the things he can do when the Dolphins go into those sub packages and bring in multiple defensive backs on the field. But again, he is a veteran. He said, hey, it's the business. I'm not going to think too much of it. And the Dolphins do have some young defensive backs who I think that they really like, whether that's Trill Williams or Sheldrick Redwine or even Verone McKinley III, the undrafted rookie from Oregon, who's on this roster right now, kind of reuniting with his old teammate Javon Holland. If there's potential that maybe some of those guys really shine in training camp, if they like what they've seen in OTAs, I mean, there's always the possibility right there. I always say you gotta kind of, trail the money and follow the money. And Eric Rowe does have a non-guaranteed salary, but again, I think that he is going to stick, barring an injury or anything like that, or a young player really shining in training camp. But to answer the question specifically, I think one name that I'm looking at that could really be a roster cut when we get to training camp is tight end Adam Shaheen. I mean, this is a guy who opened the season as a starter. I mean, last year, the Dolphins used multiple tight ends in their packages, and Adam Shaheen got a significant amount of snaps earlier in the season. But late in the season, he suffered a knee injury. Durham Smythe started to come along. In the final couple of games of the season, he was only getting about 10, 15, no more than 20 snaps a game. So again, when you look at Mike Gesicki coming back, Durham Smythe coming back, you have a second-year player in Hunter Long, who was a third-round pick just a year ago. There's been good reviews and praise from the coaches about his development so far. I mean, he could be the odd man out. I mean, you look at a guy like Stephen Carter, who doesn't have a big offensive role, but he was one of the team's core special team players last season. So if they want to keep him in a special teams role, again, it could just be a numbers game. It could maybe not be because of merit or anything like that. It could just be a numbers game. And we do know that the Dolphins are going to keep an extra fullback, likely Alec Ingold, who they signed in free agency. So that just kind of dwindles and lessens the number. I mean, we're going to see a lot of 2 tight end and 2 running back packages, which kind of leads me into my next question. But again, just when you do a numbers game and you look at who's already on the roster and whatnot, I think Adam Shaheen is definitely a guy who we could see on the roster bubble in the coming weeks. So that, like I said, that takes me into my next question from Left Coast Fin Fan, and his question is, which Dolphins tight end will work best in 21 personnel? So we get to talk real scheme and strategy, which I love. So for those who do not know, 21 personnel is 2 running backs, which that second running back is usually a fullback, 1 tight end, and 2 wide receivers. So this is a really interesting question because I think that this is a personnel grouping that we're going to see a lot from the Miami Dolphins under Mike McDaniel, who was obviously formerly the San Francisco 49ers offensive coordinator. Just real quick, the most used personnel groupings for San Francisco last season was 11 personnel, which is 1 running back, 1 tight end, 3 wide receivers. 21 personnel, which is, again, like we said, 2 running backs, 1 tight end, and then 12 personnel, which is 1 running back, 2 tight ends. But going back to the original question about the 21 personnel, I mean, that's an interesting question because that would mean that we're just seeing 1 tight end on the field. So we're going to have a running back, whether that's Sony Michel, whether that's Chase Edmonds, whether that's Raheem Mostert, and then we're going to have a fullback, Alec Ingold. We're going to have 2 wide receivers, most likely Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, and the tight end. So who will that tight end be, or who would work best? I mean, the Dolphins have a lot of tight ends on this roster right now. You have Mike Gesicki, who is kind of been regarded as a glorified slot receiver because he rarely ever lines up in line next to the offensive lineman to block. Like I said, you have Hunter Long, you have Adam Shaheen. But honestly, truthfully, I think if you're just running 21 personnel, I think that the best tight end for that could honestly be Durham Smythe. Last year, as we said before, Mike Gesicki was a glorified slot receiver. He was used out wide, he was used flanked, he was used, in the slot. And when they did bring in those 2 tight ends, it was usually Durham Smythe who actually got the blocking duties. And Pro Football Focus actually graded him out as the best blocking tight end on the team last year, just a little above Adam Shaheen. But we also saw what Durham Smythe could do catching the ball. He set career numbers and receptions and receiving yards. So I think that in terms of 21 personnel, 1 tight end, I think that just in terms of keeping defensive kind of on their heels, letting, not tipping your hat to whether it can be a running play or a passing play, I think that the best tight end for that could be Durham Smythe. that leads me into kind of a bigger picture question of like, where does that leave tight end Mike Gesicki? And we talked a lot about it a lot on this podcast about where tight end Mike Gesicki actually fits in this offense. And McDaniel kind of, downplayed the concerns about how he would fit because Gesicki's not really a blocker. He said, "Hey, I've worked with tight ends that have Mike Gesicki's skill set, and we're gonna find a way to make it work." So I think that there are going to be some really, really interesting things that they can do with Mike Gesicki, with more or less, him being a tight end in name, but using him as a wide receiver. I think we could see 12 personnel where you do have, you do have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle on the field, and then you have Mike Gesicki and Durham Smythe, but maybe you're putting Gesicki in the slot or you're moving him outside to get a favorable matchup against, a smaller cornerback or a slower running back, a slower linebacker, I should say. So, it's 12 personnel in name, but the look is kind of more like a spread look, and you're flanking or spreading out Mike Gesicki to use him best as a pass catcher. So I think that there are going to be some really, really interesting things. I mean, that's McDaniel's job right there. It's kind of the mad scientist of this offense to figure out how to incorporate Mike Gesicki in this offense and use his specific skill sets to the betterment of this team. So the last question I am going to take is a question on the rookies. The Dolphins don't have a big rookie class in terms of their actual, draft picks, just four, but they have a pretty sizable undrafted free agent class and some really interesting names. We already mentioned Rowan McKinley. They have Kellen Deesh, the offensive tackle from Arizona State, who slipped through the draft process. But this question is, how well do you think the rookies have been doing? In particular, Tyndall, Ezukama, White, Deesh, Good, and McKinley. And do you see any of them winning a role in the starting lineup? So this is a really good question because obviously every year you bring in new players, a lot of intrigue about these rookies, these young players and their potential. And I'm going to start with saying that I think overall it's kind of tough to gauge, a lot of progress. I mean, you can tell when some guys are maybe a little bigger, a little faster. You can obviously tell if they're performing well. But sometimes you don't want to put too much stock in these practices because it's not full pads and full contact and to the ground, and you're not trying to hurt your own player, so you're kind of easing up a little bit at times. But I will say that you can kind of pick some stuff here and there, especially with some of the skill position players and them standing out. And I will say, I think Zaquandre Wright, the undrafted free agent running back, I think that I have seen some nice cutbacks from him. I think the 7th round pick, quarterback Skylar Thompson, I thought he had a really, really strong practice, and I wrote about it when Tua sat out with the illness, some illness that kept them out of that OTA practice. I thought Skylar Thompson threw some really, really nice passes downfield, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with him as kind of the third quarterback and whether the Dolphins use a 53-man roster spot on him, because most teams use just 2 spots on their quarterbacks nowadays. But I think 2 names specifically stick out to me in terms of potentially carving out a role as rookies. Maybe not becoming bona fide starters, especially not even by the end of the season, but having prominent roles with this team. And that's Channing Tindall, the team's first pick, the 3rd rounder, and McKinley, who I mentioned before. So I'll start out with Tindall and kind of reiterating some points that I said before. I think that his skill set fits perfectly for this defense in terms of adding speed at the linebacker position, getting a guy who can run sideline to sideline, who has the physicality to hold up in the run, but also has the speed to match potentially tight ends and running backs in coverage. I think early on, they're going to find a very, very niche role for him. And defensive coordinator Josh Boyer kind of alluded to that. He said, we're going to throw a lot of stuff at Channing, and we're going to hope that, maybe we can carve out a role for him early on. But later on, he can do everything because we're testing him with everything. And I think that I can really envision an early role for him as a blitzer. He ran a 4.4 at the combine. Put him at outside linebacker, put him at inside linebacker, move Jerome Baker around, and just let him fly to the ball, whether that's the quarterback, whether that's a ball carrier, just let him run to the ball and make some plays. So I definitely could see that early on. And McKinley is an interesting name because, again, he's an undrafted free agent that's going to have to fight for a roster spot. But in college at Oregon, he was one of the best ball hawks in the nation. I mean, he was a finalist for the Thorpe Award, which goes to the best defensive back in the country. Over the past couple of years, there's been nobody better than him at getting their hands on the ball. But the knock on him is that he doesn't really necessarily have the size to hold up closer to the line of scrimmage. And his speed, he didn't test as well in terms of the speed. So I think there's some concerns about how he's going to hold up as a deep safety, maybe as a free safety and kind of tracking balls downfield. However, I think that there is a potential role for him as a slot cornerback, which has been floated. I mean, I believe Jim Nagy, the Herald's, my colleague Barry Jackson wrote a piece with some insight from Jim Nagy, the executive director of the Senior Bowl. And McKinley was invited to the Senior Bowl. I was out there, so I got to see him for a little bit. And he said that, while the measurables might not be there, he could potentially slot as a slot cornerback. I mean, he as a nickel back. I mean, that's Nick Needham's position. That's a spot that McKinley played a lot. And again, if maybe he doesn't have the speed to hold up as a deep safety, I think there is a potential for to fill in at nickel. I mean, I think that the Dolphins depth. I think the Dolphins, their starting lineup at cornerback is one of the best, if not the best in the NFL, with Byron Jones, Xavier Howard, and Nick Needham. But when you get after that, you kind of have some improving guys. I mean, you have Trill Williams, who hasn't really played a lot. You have Noah Igbinoghene, who hasn't really played a lot. And you have a lot of really, really young guys who just don't have that game experience. But again, I think McKinley is maybe a guy who can give you some depth at nickel. He gives you some depth at safety. But it's going to come down to him making plays. I mean, that's what it usually comes down for these guys, these undrafted guys specifically. A lot of times the draft picks get a bit of a longer leash to make mistakes. But as an undrafted rookie, you really got to put yourself out there and make plays. And I think that, again, he was one of the best ball hawks in college football. So maybe he gets hot during training camp. He gets his hands on a few passes, intercepts a few attempts, and really opens some eyes. So it's going to be interesting to see. But those are just two rookies that I think, again, Tyndall's going to make this roster. He's going to find a role early on. But if McKinley can make this roster as well, I think that he definitely has the skill set to contribute to this team. So last, before I get out, I want to quickly preview mandatory minicamp. Again, the Dolphins start their first of 2 days of mandatory minicamp on Wednesday. The previous sessions have been voluntary, so it should be good to see, barring maybe some injuries that are sidelining some guys, it should be good to see a lot of these veterans. And I'm really interested, again, to see, first off, how this offensive line looks with Teron Armstead back, in the fold. I mean, he hasn't practiced yet in any practices open to the media, but he's still been around the facility. We've seen him after practice working with a lot of these young guys, working on techniques. That's one of those things that we all really had our eyes on when they signed Teron Armstead. Was, obviously he's going to bring a lot on the field, but he's going to be a mentor and a veteran voice to a lot of these young guys who maybe haven't developed at the pace that all of us would have liked to see. So it's going to be interesting to see what the offense looks like, whether it flows a little better, and just overall Teron Armstead's impact on this offensive line and that entire unit. And the second thing I'm interested in seeing is, how the defense looks with, its bookend corners, if both of them are participating. McDaniel did say that, for a lot of these veterans, the offseason workout program just isn't really beneficial. So obviously we haven't seen Xavier Howard, a multi-time Pro Bowler. We haven't seen him at these practices yet. It's been a lot of Noah Igbinoghene and Nick Needham. But again, I think we will get a better look at this new defense that Josh Boyer is kind of leading, with Xavier Howard in the forward, as well as potentially Byron Jones. We all know he underwent some offseason procedure on his Achilles ankle area, and that potentially could keep him out of mandatory minicamp. But if it does, he's expected to be back in time for training camp. But if he does happen to participate in mandatory minicamp, again, it'll be great to see how that defense looks, because they kept everyone. They brought everyone back and added some more pieces. So this is definitely a defense that is ready to hit the ground running and kind of, reflect the unit that we saw the second half of the 2021 season. So it should be definitely should be a fun 2 days in Miami Gardens at the Baptist Health Training Complex. We'll be there. at the Miami Herald to recap both days of mandatory minicamp, what Mike McDaniel says, what various players say. So definitely keep your eyes locked on Miami Herald, MiamiHerald.com for the latest updates on the Dolphins. That brings us to the end of another edition of the Dolphins In Depth podcast. Again, I want to thank all the fans and all the readers who submitted questions to me. Sorry I couldn't get to everything, but if you enjoyed this and want to do this again, definitely let me know on Twitter. We'll do this again, and I'll take a bunch of fan questions. But again, really looking forward to mandatory minicamp, and we'll be back next week to recap that. But until then, you guys take care. See you.